Hello Junior Tuckies, welcome to the exam preparation for Paper 2 lessons. I'm Mrs. Bredenkamp and I'm going to guide you through how you should be writing your Paper 2. Let's get into it. First up, let's address the poetry essay. What is it? It is an in-depth analysis of a poem. They want you to engage with the question, not just tell your marker or your teacher what's happening in the poem. It's a formal piece of writing with no contractions and no slang. You write in the present tense and you do not use third person like I or in my opinion. You should be focusing on specific elements of a poem, either the imagery, tone, mood, diction, style, punctuation, title, and register. We also use the Peel method with this type of essay. If you would like to know a more in-depth lesson about a poetry essay, please go see my grade 11 lesson on the poetry essay. Here are some general poetry tips. First of all, study all poetic devices and how to explain the function of these poetic devices. This is going to get you at least 50% there when you're answering any type of poetry question. Then, where there is a 2 to 3 mark question, I've given an example of how you should be answering that. So let's have a look at the example. Identify the figure of speech and discuss its effectiveness for 3 marks. So the first thing that you need to do is identify the figure of speech using the correct terminology. Remember, if you're explaining personification, you need to explain it in context of that poem. What human features are being applied to this inanimate object from the poem? Then, why is it effective? This question is something that stumps most learners. I want you to think of it as, what does it add to the poem? How does it make us understand better as the reader? And then the third part of that answer is going to be, why did the poet add it? What type of impact did he or she want when she added this figure of speech? And then a good tip over here is to make use of online or hard copy resources as well as past papers. You might even find a question that is similar to the one that you have in your paper in December. Now let's have a look at some poetry contextual question tips. Let's have a look at image or imagery. The things that you need to look at there is discussing the elements. Is it a metaphor? Is it a sound device? You need to be able to discuss and explain the function, like I said in the previous slide, effectively. Then, of course, explaining the effectiveness. What does this use of imagery add to the poem? What does it help us understand better, or visualize better, or even hear better? Then what's the significance of the image or the imagery that's being used? What does it connect to? Does it connect to previous images in the poem or actually to the poet's life and their story? Then appropriateness. How well has the imagery been used? And then of course meaning. How is it working to convey its meaning and the importance in context? How is it being explained? Then, of course, connotation. This is incredibly important. NB. The connotation is the thoughts, feelings, and emotions around a specific word. And you need to explore what those connotations mean in the context of the poem. When questions refer candidates to specific lines, it is only those lines that must be explored and explained. Do not go further along in the poem or do not progress back in the poem. Let's practice on the next slide. Alright, let's have a look at an example. This is a English Home Language Paper 2 from 2018. It is also an Eastern Cape paper over here, so I'm going to be using this one as an example for these lessons on paper 2. So you'll see here your marks are out of 80 and your time limit is 2.5 hours. So I'm going to go through the instructions because that is one of the most important elements when we are doing any type of question paper, is to always read the instructions. So it says here to read the page carefully before you begin. We know this. And then it says, do not attempt to read the entire question paper. Why is this? because grade 11s, you need to pick your questions. Okay, if you do the entire question paper, you're probably not going to finish. And then also, what's going to happen is that your marker's only going to mark the first section that you did. So let's see how this question paper is divided up. 3 different sections. We have section A, which is always poetry, for 30 marks. We have section B, which is your novel, for 25 marks. And then we have section C, the drama, for 25 marks. Then it does say here, follow the instructions at the beginning of each section carefully. Now, here becomes the confusing bit, but it's actually not that bad. So you need to answer 5 questions in total. So you need to choose 3 questions in section A, 1 question in section B, whether that be the contextual or the lit essay, and then you need to choose 1 section or 1 question in section C also, whether it be the contextual or the lit essay. In section A, our poetry, we usually have the contextual questions or the poetry essay. You need to answer 3. Then you number as the questions are, that's normal. Start a new section on a new page, or each section on a new page. This is good to do, please, because usually your markers are sharing or doing group marking. And these are the time estimates for each section. So you should spend 40 minutes on section A, 55 minutes on section B, and another 55 on section C. Now let's look at length of answers. So essay questions on poetry should be answered in 250 to 300 words. That would be your poetry essay. And then essay questions on the novel and drama should be 400 to 450 words. So that would be your lit essay. So remember, the length of the contextual questions should be determined by the mark allocation. That's why I tell you why it's so important. Then, your choice of answers for section B and section C, which is what I explained to you now. Only answer the questions on the novel and drama that you have studied. So in grade 11, you probably will not have these choices unless you are writing a common paper. In the different schools, people do different poetry, they do different dramas and novels as well. So this is kind of how a grade 12 paper would be. You would only pick the questions that you have done, your novel and your drama. This is very important because you don't want to be writing about something you've never read before. So you need to answer 1 essay question and 1 contextual question from either section. So if you answer the question in section B, the essay question in section B, you must answer the contextual questions in section C, and vice versa. If you decide in question C that you want to do the essay question, you must do the contextual questions in section B. Then you should get a little table of contents like this, so you will see that the essay question is on this poem over here. Then we have the contextual questions over here for African poem, the author to her book, and Sonnet 130. We have the mark allocation, we have the page number, and then you must do unseen poetry. This is a compulsory question. No matter what, you never ever get a choice. So it says over here, answer any 2 questions. So I am going to go over Sonnet 130 with you because this is quite a common poem to teach in high school. I think many of you might have done it in grade 10 or in grade 11. But remember, you need to answer 2 questions over here with the seen poetry and then, of course, your unseen. Then if we move on to the novel, you answer only on the novel you have studied. Please, grade 11s. So let's perhaps say in my particular school that I teach at, we are doing Tsotsi in grade 11. So the focus would be on Tsotsi over here. So you're going to choose and answer 1 of the 4 questions, okay? So let's say I want to choose the essay question for Tsotsi for the novel section B. Then in the drama, you must also only answer the ones you have studied. I must pick the contextual question for Macbeth as well. Okay, So I've chosen the essay question for Tutsi. I said I'm doing this one. I'm committed. Then I must do the contextual questions for Macbeth. But if you'd like to do it the other way around, and perhaps you want to do the contextual questions for Tutsi, then you can do the essay question for Macbeth. All right, so that is just the instructions. Let's go have a look at the memo and what the markers are told. All right, so note to the markers, the marking guideline is intended as a guide for markers. A candidate's response must be considered on their merits. This is very important. Markers do read your questions, okay? Or your answers, rather. They read what you say. If you're able to validate it with substantial evidence, they will have a look and see if they can award the mark to you. So, big points over here. If more than the required number of questions have been done, okay, you only mark the first response or the first answer. So, in section A, if a candidate has answered all 4 questions on the scene poetry, you only mark the first 2. Then in section B and C, if the candidate has done all 2 questions, answered 2 questions on the contextual and 2 essay questions, you mark the first one and you have to ignore the second one. If the candidate has answered all 4 questions, you mark only the first answer in the first section, provided that 1 contextual and 1 essay has been answered. So if a candidate does give 2 answers, where the first one is wrong, the next one is correct, okay, you have to mark the first one and ignore the next. So for example, let's say they say identify the figure of speech, and you say, obviously this is completely out of context, metaphor / personification. And personification is actually the correct answer. The marker has to ignore that. Then you need to mark, or the people need to mark according to the memo. If a spelling error affects the meaning, you must mark it incorrectly. So be mindful of your spelling. Then the essay question. If their essay is shorter than the required word count, do not penalize, okay? Because the candidate has already penalized him or herself. What this means is, grade 11s, is that if you have a shorter essay, it means that you didn't develop your argument further. So the marker isn't going to penalize you for that. They are just going to, unfortunately, see the proof in the pudding, the essay that you've written. Then, if the essay is too long, consider and assess a maximum of 50 words beyond the required word limit, and then you need to ignore the rest of the essay. Then for the contextual questions, if the candidate does not use inverted commas when asked to quote, you do not penalize. Then when answering contextual questions must be assessed holistically, so we need to look at it wholly as a big part of a whole. Part marks should be awarded in proportion to the fullness of the response to each question. And then once again, this is just a guide. Now, I'm going to move into the contextual questions for Sonnet 130. Let me just scroll down to there. All right, so we have Sonnet 130 over here, William Shakespeare, very common one to do in the grades, and that's why I'll be working through this particular poem with you. Now, let's have a read. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such rose see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground, and yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she believed with false compare. Now, let's have a look at the questions. 4.1. From the descriptions in line 5 and 6, describe what a woman's complexion should look like. So what do they want from you? So you need to look in lines 5 and 6, and you need to describe what a woman's complexion should look like. So when they're asking you to describe, you need to explain and for the 2 marks. So let's look in lines 5 and 6. So I've seen roses damasked, okay, so red and white, but I see no such rose in her cheeks. So a woman should have pale skin and rosy cheeks. But unfortunately, in his mistress, he doesn't see this. But let's have a look what the memo says. So moving on to question 3. Over here, excuse me. Here we go. So, from the descriptions in line 5 and 6, she should have red cheeks and a white skin. So that's what this roses damasked and red and white means over here. And that is the full 2 marks. Let's look at 4.2. Are Shakespeare's observations in the quatrains cynical or not? Explain your answer. Now, what are they asking for? They're asking if Shakespeare's observations in the quatrains are cynical or not. Then you need to explain your answer for 2 marks. So what do they want from you? Over here, this is going to be quite tricky because you obviously need to know your terminology of what a quatrain is. That is 4 lines, basically like a little stanza with a specific rhyme scheme. And then you need to understand what the word cynical means. It means critical of someone. Okay? So you're going to say yes or no. Remember, you don't get answers for yes or no. And then you need to explain your answer. Why do you say so? Give evidence of why you say so. Okay, so let's have a look. I think he's quite cynical of her, but let's see what the memo says. So you could have said no. Okay, women, like men, are not perfect. Shakespeare is more realistic. He loves his mistress despite her shortcomings, and that is for the 2 mark. Then you could consider a yes merit or an answer over here, like I would have said. I would have said that definitely he says that in his quatrains, especially when he talks about the fact that her breath actually smells, that he doesn't want, or his mistress's breath reeks. Okay, he's been quite cynical of her, in my opinion. And then the black wires grow out of her head. Okay, in my opinion, he's been quite cynical. He's being a little bit rude, but in the end, of course, where we have our Volta, it does say that she cannot be compared to anyone in this world. So I suppose it does end off at a good note, but you do get the option to have the yes or no answer. Then 4.3, refer to line 12. Comment on the effect pace has on the meaning of this line for 3 marks. So we need to look at line 12. We need to comment on. We need to talk about. We need to discuss the effect of pace. Okay, what effect do we need to look at? On the meaning of the line. And we need to do that for 3 whole marks over here. So I'm just going to erase. So let's have a look at this is line 10, 11, and 12. And my mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. Now let's think about pace. What do we need to think about with pace? What slows down the pace in a poem? That is definitely your commas over here. So what effect would commas have on the meaning of this line? So my mistress, when she walks, she treads on the ground. When you tread on something, let's look at the connotation of the word tread. When you tread on something, it's not graceful, it's not pretty, it's quite hard, thumping, almost, really walking on the ground as hard as you can. So these commas can act as a way to slow down the pace, to almost mimic her treading on the ground. But let's have a look at the memo. So over here, the pace slows into monosyllabic words, so 1-syllable words. It indicates a heavy, dull treading of the mistress's walk, and then the sound adds to the image of the lover's heavy gait, her ungraceful stride, if we can say it like that, for the full 3 marks. So I had it where I was looking at commas. That definitely could be added to there, but once again, we do have the monosyllabic words. So when she walks, treads on the ground. Okay. Then 4.4, let's have a look at the last question for this section. Analyze how the sonnet form supports the speaker's attitude to his mistress. Now, this is a wonderful question. If you ever get a sonnet to grade 11, so I'm going to ask you about form. Teachers love it. I love setting questions on that. So you need to analyze, so you need to critically view, you need to do an in-depth analysis, almost like an autopsy of the poem, and how the sonnet form supports the speaker's attitude of his mistress. And this is for 3 marks over here. So what do we need to do? We need to analyze. What do we need to analyze? The sonnet form. Okay, so first of all, you need to know the details of the sonnet form. And then how does the sonnet form actually support the speaker's attitude towards his mistress? But what is the speaker's attitude? So at the end over here, he tells us, and yet, this yet over here, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. Okay, so he says, actually, if I think about it, my love is beyond anyone else's. It's a rare love. Why? Because if I have to compare this mistress to anyone else, she just doesn't compare. She's the best. All right, so sonnet form, let's think about it. The 14 lines, 3 quatrains, the rhyming couplets, and then, of course, your volta. So you need to discuss all of those things in conjunction. You need to talk about the form of the sonnet. You need to speak about the attitude of Shakespeare, and then you need to say, how does this form of the sonnet support the attitude? So let's have a look at the memo. So the quatrains list the many unpleasant and unflattering qualities of the mistress. They establish beyond doubt that the woman is very unattractive physically. Then the rhyming couplet at the end contradicts the speaker's attitude, where I said, and yet. He unequivocally swears, so he swears by heaven, that his love for his mistress is rare. He looks beyond her physical condition, and he actually loves that. Then, a very important part over here, award 3 marks only if at least 2 characteristics of the sonnet are addressed, and then you will get your full 3 marks and your 10 out of 10. That's the end of the lesson about poetry contextual questions. Next up is unseen poetry. Bye!